The silence in the Pentagon's Operations Center was deafening, as General Patricia Hayes, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, turned to face me across the mahogany conference table. Her steel-gray eyes held mine as she spoke the words that would change everything. "Major General Mitchell, Operation Ironclad is your command. The President has personally requested your oversight. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss." But that moment was still months away. This story begins in a place far from the corridors of power, in a modest split-level home in Riverside, Ohio, where my own family had just delivered the cruelest blow of all. My name is David Mitchell, and at 34 I was supposedly the failure of the family. I sat at our annual 4th of July barbecue, watching the smoke rise from my stepfather's grill, listening to the familiar soundtrack of my inadequacy being played once again. The smell of charcoal and lighter fluid, mixed with the oppressive humidity of an Ohio summer, creating an atmosphere as stifling as the conversation. "Pass the potato salad, will you, David?" My mother, Linda, barely glanced in my direction as she spoke. Her attention was focused entirely on my half-brother Marcus, who was regaling the table with stories of his latest promotion at Northbrook Financial. Marcus had always been the golden child, the one who chose the sensible path of corporate success. "So then the client says to me," Marcus continued, his voice booming across the backyard, "Marcus, you've just saved our company $12 million in tax liability." He paused for effect, soaking in the admiring murmurs from our assembled relatives. "And that's when they offered me the senior vice president position." My stepfather, Bill Hartman, raised his beer bottle in salute. "Now that's what I call a real career, making real money, real impact." His eyes found mine across the table, and the disappointment was as clear as the condensation on his bottle. Not like some people who are content to waste their lives in dead-end government jobs. The words hit like a physical blow. Dead-end government job. If only they knew that my dead-end position involved overseeing intelligence operations that protected millions of American lives. If only they understood that while Marcus was saving wealthy clients money, I was quite literally saving the country. My mother set down her fork and fixed me with that look, the one that had haunted me since I was 16 and first announced my intention to attend West Point. "David, honey, when are you going to get serious about your future? You're 34 years old. Marcus was making 6 figures by the time he was your age." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, that suffocating feeling of being completely misunderstood by the people who should have known me best. Around the table sat my aunts, uncles, and cousins, all nodding in agreement. They saw a man in khakis and a polo shirt, someone who looked ordinary, unremarkable. They had no idea that beneath this suburban dad exterior was someone who held one of the highest security clearances in the nation. "The benefits aren't bad," I offered weakly, knowing how pathetic it sounded even as the words left my mouth. It was true, of course, but try explaining to a table full of civilians that the real benefit was knowing you were part of something larger than yourself. Something that mattered on a scale they couldn't comprehend. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. "Benefits? David, in the real world we call those participation trophies. When you're ready to join the adults and make some actual money, I can probably get you an entry-level position at Northbrook. Start you off in the mailroom, work your way up." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Entry-level position. Mailroom. This from someone who had never been trusted with information that could topple governments or start wars. This from someone whose biggest responsibility was managing other people's tax shelters. My Aunt Carol chimed in, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Oh, David, that's so generous of Marcus to offer. You really should consider it, dear. Government work is so limiting. And with the way things are going politically, those jobs aren't even secure anymore." Secure? The irony was almost laughable. While they worried about job security in the private sector, I was one of maybe 24 people in the entire country who knew about the terrorist cell we'd disrupted just last month. I was one of the few who understood how close we'd come to another September 11th, and how the work my team and I did had prevented it. But I couldn't say any of that. I couldn't explain that my dead-end government job involved briefing the President's National Security Council. I couldn't tell them that foreign intelligence agencies had put a price on my head precisely because of how effective I was at my work. The very nature of my success demanded absolute secrecy. I appreciate the offer, Marcus, but I'm committed to my current position. I tried to keep my voice level professional. It was the same tone I used when briefing cabinet members, but here at this backyard barbecue, it just sounded defensive. Bill Hartman shook his head, disappointment etched across his weathered features. Committed to mediocrity, more like it. When I was your age, I was building something. I was making a name for myself. Your mother and we just want to see you succeed, son. Son. The word stung because it was meant to sting. Bill had married my mother when I was already at West Point, but he'd never missed an opportunity to remind me that I wasn't living up to his standards. He owned a small chain of auto parts stores across southern Ohio, successful enough to afford a comfortable lifestyle, but nothing that would ever make headlines. Yet in his mind, that made him more accomplished than someone who had dedicated their life to national service. Maybe it's time to think about settling down too, my mother added, her voice taking on that particular tone mothers use when they're about to deliver unwanted life advice. Marcus has been with Jennifer for 3 years now. They're talking about marriage, maybe starting a family. When are you going to find a nice girl and give me some grandchildren? The assumption that I was somehow incomplete, that my life lacked meaning because I wasn't following their prescribed path of marriage and suburban domesticity, cut deeper than their professional criticism. They had no idea that my work required sacrifices they couldn't imagine. Relationships were complicated when you couldn't tell the person you loved what you actually did for a living. Dates became exercises in creative storytelling, and long-term commitments felt impossible when half your life had to remain classified. I glanced around the table at their expectant faces, all waiting for me to acknowledge my failures and promise to do better. These were the people who should have been proud of me, who should have supported my choices even if they didn't understand them. Instead, they saw me as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when someone aimed too low and settled for too little. The 4th of July fireworks began in the distance, their colorful explosions painting the darkening sky. How fitting, I thought, that we were celebrating American independence while I felt more trapped than ever by my family's narrow definition of success. Those fireworks represented the country I'd sworn to protect, the ideals I'd dedicated my life to defending. But the people sitting around this table couldn't see past their own limited understanding of what it meant to serve something greater than yourself. As the evening wore on, the criticism continued in smaller, more subtle doses. Marcus held court with stories of client dinners and business trips, painting a picture of a life filled with importance and recognition. My relatives hung on every word, asking follow-up questions and offering congratulations. When the conversation briefly turned to me, it was only to express concern about my situation or to suggest ways I might improve my prospects. By the time I said my goodbyes and walked to my car, the weight of their disappointment felt heavier than the humid summer air. I sat in my Honda Civic, another source of family shame, since Marcus drove a BMW, and stared back at the house. Through the kitchen window, I could see them still talking, probably discussing my shortcomings and wondering where they'd gone wrong with me. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that in less than 72 hours I would be back in Washington, walking through security checkpoints they couldn't imagine, into briefing rooms where the fate of nations was decided. They didn't know that the President of the United States knew my name, that foreign leaders had been warned about my capabilities, that I was already being considered for promotion to a rank that would make me one of the youngest major generals in military history. But as I drove home through the quiet streets of Riverside, past the neat lawns and modest homes of my childhood, that knowledge felt more like a burden than a comfort. The people who should have been proudest of me saw only failure, and the success I'd achieved was invisible to the ones whose approval I'd always craved most. The pattern of being overlooked hadn't started at that 4th of July barbecue. It was a carefully woven tapestry of disappointment that my family had been crafting for over 15 years, each thread representing another moment when they chose to see failure where others saw excellence. I remember the exact moment it began. I was 19, home for Christmas break during my sophomore year at West Point. The living room was decorated with my mother's usual holiday precision, every ornament perfectly placed, every light strand meticulously arranged. The family had gathered for our traditional Christmas Eve dinner, and I was wearing my dress gray uniform, the one I'd worked so hard to earn the right to wear. My stepfather Bill took one look at me and frowned. "What's with the costume, David? This isn't Halloween." Costume. That single word reduced 4 years of the most rigorous military training in the world to a child's dress-up game. I tried to explain the significance of the uniform, the honor it represented, but Bill had already turned his attention to Marcus, who was showing off his acceptance letter to Northwestern's business school. "Now that's impressive," Bill had said, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. "A real future in business. That's how you build wealth, son, not playing soldier." My mother had nodded enthusiastically, her pride radiating across the room, but none of it directed toward me. "We're so proud of Marcus for choosing a practical path," she'd said, her eyes deliberately avoiding mine. "Some people chase dreams, but Marcus understands reality." The implication was crystal clear. I was the dreamer, the impractical one, the son who had chosen fantasy over substance. What they didn't understand was that West Point wasn't a dream. It was the most academically challenging and physically demanding experience I'd ever endured. While Marcus was learning about profit margins and market analysis, I was studying military history, strategic planning, and leadership under pressure. While he was attending fraternity parties, I was learning how to make decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for the soldiers under my command. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The pattern continued through my early military career. When I graduated as a second lieutenant and was stationed at Fort Bragg, my family treated it like an extended summer camp. "When are you going to get a real job?" became my mother's standard greeting during our monthly phone calls. She'd update me on Marcus's latest achievements: his internship at a Fortune 500 company, his new apartment in Chicago, his engagement to Jennifer, while treating my military service like an elaborate hobby I'd eventually outgrow. The worst part was Christmas when I came home after my first deployment. I'd spent 8 months in Afghanistan, leading intelligence operations in one of the most dangerous regions of the country. I'd been awarded a Bronze Star for my service, an honor that recognized exceptional bravery and dedication in a combat zone. I was 25 years old and had already proven myself in ways that most people never would, but when I walked through my mother's front door, the first thing she said was, "Oh good, you're finally home. Maybe now you can help Marcus move into his new house." I'd just returned from a war zone, carrying experiences and responsibilities that would have broken most people, and my family saw me as free labor for Marcus's real estate transaction. The Bronze Star went unmentioned, unacknowledged, as if my military decorations were participation trophies from a community softball league. That same visit, I overheard my mother talking to her sister on the phone. "I just don't understand what David is thinking," she'd said, her voice carrying clearly through the thin walls of our house. "He could be making real money by now if he'd just listened to Bill. Instead, he's wasting his best years on this military nonsense. At least Marcus has his head on straight." Military nonsense. 25 years old, and my service to my country was nonsense in my own mother's eyes. The dismissal became more sophisticated as I advanced in rank. When I made captain, my family's reaction was polite indifference. When I was promoted to major, Bill actually rolled his eyes. "Another promotion in the world's most inefficient bureaucracy," he'd said. "In the real world, promotions come with real money. How much are you making now anyway?" The question was a trap, and we both knew it. Military pay, while respectable, couldn't compete with the salaries that private sector executives commanded. But what Bill didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that some things couldn't be measured in dollars. The responsibility I carried, the trust placed in me, the knowledge that my decisions affected national security, these had value beyond any paycheck. When Marcus bought his first BMW, the family treated it like a Nobel Prize announcement. Photos were shared, congratulations flowed, and Bill actually threw a small party to celebrate his stepson's symbol of success. When I was selected for the Army's Advanced Intelligence Training Program, an honor reserved for the top 1% of officers, my mother's response was, "That's nice, dear. Have you given any thought to what you'll do when you get out?" The assumption that I would eventually get out, that my military career was a temporary detour rather than a calling, became the background music of every family interaction. They spoke about my future in corporate terms, as if my 15 years of service were simply an extended internship before I joined the real world of business and profit. The breaking point came during Marcus's promotion party last fall. Northbrook Financial had promoted him to vice president, and my parents threw a celebration dinner at the nicest restaurant in town. The entire extended family was there, along with Marcus's colleagues and their spouses. I sat at a table in the corner, watching as speech after speech praised Marcus's business acumen and bright future. When it came time for my stepfather's toast, he stood with visible pride and raised his glass. "To Marcus," he announced, his voice carrying across the restaurant's dining room, who understood from day one that success means building something real, something that lasts. Unlike some people who choose to work for the government, Marcus creates value, he generates wealth, he makes a difference in the real world. The entire room turned to look at me during that last sentence. I felt the weight of their judgment, their pity, their complete inability to comprehend that serving in the military was every bit as valuable as any corporate position. In their minds, I was the cautionary tale, the family member who had taken the wrong path and was now paying the price for my poor choices. After the toast, Marcus's colleagues came over to offer their condolences disguised as career advice. "Have you ever considered transitioning to the private sector?" one of them asked. "With your military background, you might be able to get an entry-level position in corporate security." Entry-level, corporate security. This from people who had never been responsible for anything more critical than quarterly earnings reports. They saw my military experience as barely relevant, a minor credential that might qualify me for glorified guard duty. The most painful moment came when Jennifer, Marcus's fiancée, pulled me aside with genuine concern. "David, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but are you happy? I mean, really happy? Because it seems like you're just stuck. Marcus and I were talking, and we think you might be afraid to leave the military, because it's all you know. But there's so much more out there. You could have a real career, make real money, maybe even find someone to settle down with." Her words were meant to be kind, but they revealed the fundamental disconnect between my family's values and my own. In their world, happiness was measured by salary and status symbols. They couldn't conceive of finding fulfillment in service, honor, or duty. They saw my dedication to the military as fear rather than commitment, limitation rather than purpose. That night, I drove home to my modest apartment and sat in my car for a long time, staring at the building where I lived alone. My neighbors were mostly other military personnel and government employees, people who understood the value of public service, who didn't measure worth exclusively in financial terms. But even their respect couldn't erase the sting of my family's constant disappointment. What made it worse was knowing that I couldn't defend myself, couldn't explain what I really did, couldn't share the achievements that mattered most. The classified nature of my work meant that my greatest successes had to remain secret, while Marcus's most mundane accomplishments were celebrated with champagne and congratulations. As I finally walked up to my apartment that night, I wondered if my family would ever see me as anything more than their greatest disappointment, the son who had chosen service over success, duty over dollars. What I didn't know then was that very soon, the veil of secrecy would be lifted in the most dramatic way possible, and they would finally understand exactly who David Mitchell really was. While my family saw a man treading water in a dead-end government position, the reality of my life existed in a completely different universe, one hidden behind layers of security clearances and classified briefings that would have left them speechless. My real world began each morning at 04:30 hours in my Pentagon office, located 3 levels below ground in a section that didn't appear on any public building plans. The hallways were unmarked, accessible only through biometric scanners and armed security checkpoints. My official title, Director of Advanced Intelligence Operations, appeared on exactly 7 documents in the entire federal government, and none of those documents would ever see daylight. The irony was suffocating. While Marcus bragged about managing million-dollar accounts, I was overseeing operations with budgets that dwarfed the GDP of small nations. While he celebrated closing deals with corporate clients, I was coordinating with intelligence agencies from allied nations, managing assets in hostile territories, and analyzing threats that could reshape global politics. My typical Tuesday morning would begin with a secure video conference with station chiefs in Berlin, Seoul, and Tel Aviv. We'd review intelligence gathered overnight, communications intercepts, satellite imagery, human intelligence reports that painted a picture of emerging threats across 3 continents. The conversations happened in code, using terminology that had taken me years to master, discussing operations that most people couldn't imagine in their wildest nightmares. On this particular Tuesday, the topic was a suspected arms smuggling network operating between Eastern Europe and North Africa. The intelligence suggested a connection to terrorist cells planning attacks on American interests abroad. My job was to coordinate a multi-agency response that would involve the CIA, NSA, and military assets from 4 different countries. The operation, codenamed Desert Falcon, would either prevent thousands of deaths or fail spectacularly, potentially triggering an international incident. After the video conference, I'd walk down the corridor to the Situation Room's smaller counterpart, where I'd brief senior Pentagon officials on overnight developments. Yesterday's briefing covered 3 active operations: monitoring unusual military movements along the Syrian border, tracking suspected cyber attacks on American infrastructure originating from state-sponsored hackers, and coordinating with the FBI on a domestic terrorism investigation that had international connections. The weight of these responsibilities was something my family could never comprehend. While they worried about quarterly profits and mortgage payments, I carried the knowledge that a single mistake in my analysis could lead to diplomatic crises, military conflicts, or terrorist attacks. The decisions I made, the recommendations I provided, the intelligence I gathered, all of it had the potential to alter the course of history. But perhaps the most surreal aspect of my double life was the caliber of people who sought my counsel. Last month, the Secretary of Defense had personally requested my assessment of emerging threats in the South China Sea. The conversation lasted 2 hours, covering everything from military positioning to economic implications to long-term strategic concerns. He listened carefully to my recommendations, took detailed notes, and ended the meeting by saying, "Mitchell, your insights on this are invaluable. I need you to brief the Joint Chiefs next week." The Joint Chiefs of Staff. The highest-ranking military officers in the nation, men and women whose names appeared in history books, were waiting to hear my analysis. Yet when I called my mother that evening, she spent 20 minutes complaining that I hadn't sent a congratulations card for Marcus's latest promotion. The disconnect became even more pronounced when foreign delegations visited Washington. 2 weeks ago, I spent 3 days in meetings with senior intelligence officials from NATO countries, discussing coordinated responses to Russian disinformation campaigns. The British representative, a man with 30 years of experience in international intelligence, pulled me aside after one session. "Colonel Mitchell," he'd said, using the rank I held in addition to my civilian position, "your understanding of hybrid warfare tactics is extraordinary. London has specifically requested that you be included in next month's strategic planning conference. The Prime Minister's security advisor wants your perspective on emerging threats." The Prime Minister's security advisor. Foreign governments were requesting my expertise, yet my own family saw me as someone who couldn't manage his own career properly. The security clearances I held were themselves a testament to the trust placed in me by the highest levels of government. My top-secret/sensitive compartmented information clearance gave me access to some of the most closely guarded secrets in American intelligence. The background investigation for that clearance had taken 18 months and involved interviews with hundreds of people from my past, financial audits going back decades, and polygraph examinations that would have broken most people. But beyond the clearances were the special access programs, the black budget operations that existed in the shadows of the intelligence community. I was read into compartments with names like Silent Ghost and Emerald Shield, programs so classified that acknowledging their existence was a federal crime. The work involved tracking weapons of mass destruction, monitoring terrorist financing networks, and coordinating responses to threats that would never make the evening news, because neutralizing them required absolute secrecy. My computer systems reflected this hidden reality. While my family assumed I worked on some mundane government database, my workstation connected to networks that spanned the globe. Real-time satellite feeds showed me military movements in hostile nations. Encrypted communication systems linked me directly to field operatives in dangerous territories. Intelligence analysis software processed thousands of data points hourly, looking for patterns that might indicate emerging threats. The physical artifacts of my real career were equally impressive but completely invisible to civilian eyes. In my office sat commendations signed by 3 different presidents, thanking me for services to national security that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. I had letters of appreciation from foreign intelligence chiefs, whose governments owed their stability partly to operations I'd helped coordinate. My personnel file contained performance evaluations that used phrases like exceptional strategic insight, invaluable operational contribution, and recommended for accelerated promotion. But perhaps the most telling indicator of my actual importance was the security detail that occasionally accompanied me. During periods of heightened threat levels, when intelligence indicated that foreign governments had identified American intelligence officers as targets, I would find myself with discreet protection, men and women who maintained careful distances, but ensured my safety. My family never noticed these shadows, never realized that their unsuccessful son was considered valuable enough to warrant government protection. The financial compensation for my work, while modest compared to private sector executive salaries, came with benefits that Marcus's corporate position could never match. My security clearance alone was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in the private sector. Defense contractors regularly offered me positions with starting salaries that would have impressed even my stepfather. But those offers missed the point entirely. I wasn't in this career for money. The real compensation came in the form of responsibility, trust, and the knowledge that my work mattered on a scale few people could comprehend. When I successfully identified the financial networks funding terrorist organizations, freezing millions of dollars intended for attacks on American soil, no newspaper covered the story. When my analysis prevented a diplomatic crisis between allied nations, preventing a conflict that could have destabilized an entire region, there were no public accolades. But the people who mattered, the President, the National Security Council, the intelligence community, they knew exactly what I had accomplished. My colleagues in this hidden world represented the best and brightest from every branch of government and military service. PhD economists who tracked terrorist financing, former special forces operators who understood unconventional warfare, computer scientists who could penetrate the most sophisticated cyber defenses, linguists who spoke languages most people had never heard of. These were the people who understood my work, who appreciated my contributions, who saw me as a valuable member of a team protecting American interests around the world. The irony was almost cosmic in its scope. While my family worried about my inability to make something of myself, I was already working at the highest levels of government, trusted with information that could topple regimes and consulted by leaders whose decisions shaped global politics. While they saw stagnation, I was actually being groomed for promotion to Major General, a rank that would make me one of the youngest general officers in the military and place me in the highest echelons of American defense leadership. But the most painful aspect of this hidden success was its loneliness. Every achievement had to remain secret. Every accolade went unshared. Every moment of professional triumph was experienced in isolation from the people whose approval I still foolishly craved. My family measured success in terms they could understand: salary, title, recognition, material possessions. My success existed in classified briefings, encrypted communications, and meetings that officially never happened. As I sat in my Pentagon office that Tuesday evening, reviewing intelligence reports that would influence American foreign policy for the next decade, I wondered what my family would think if they could see me now. But that was a fantasy that could never become reality, until circumstances beyond my control would soon make it impossible to maintain the charade any longer. The moment that shattered my last thread of tolerance came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening in November, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. I was driving back to my apartment after one of the most intense briefings of my career, a 4-hour session with the National Security Council about emerging threats in the Persian Gulf, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my mother's number, and despite the exhaustion weighing on my shoulders, I answered. David, thank goodness I caught you, she said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of barely controlled panic that usually meant someone needed something from me. We have a situation and I need you to come home this weekend. I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, the windshield wipers fighting against the November rain. What kind of situation, Mom? It's Marcus, she said, and I could hear her pacing in the background. He's been having some trouble at work. Nothing serious, just some political nonsense with his new boss. But his company is hosting this big client event on Saturday, and all the employees are supposed to bring their families for support. Jennifer's parents are coming, Bill's gonna be there, and we thought it would look better if Marcus had his whole family there. I sat in my car, listening to the rain drum against the roof, already knowing where this conversation was headed. So you want me to come home for Marcus's work event? It would mean so much to him, David, and to us. You know how important this promotion is to him. He's up for senior vice president, and this event could really make the difference. The whole executive team will be there, including the CEO. The request itself wasn't unreasonable, but the timing couldn't have been worse. I was in the middle of coordinating a complex intelligence operation that had international implications. The weekend would involve encrypted communications with assets overseas, analysis of time-sensitive intelligence reports, and preparation for Monday's briefing with the Joint Chiefs. But I couldn't explain any of that to my mother. I'm not sure I can make it, I said carefully. I have work commitments this weekend. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before she responded, and when she did, her voice had changed completely. The panic was gone, replaced by cold disappointment. Work commitments, she repeated flatly. David, what could possibly be so important in your job that you can't take one weekend to support your brother? How could I explain that the work commitments involved preventing what our intelligence suggested could be a coordinated terrorist attack on American military bases in the Middle East? How could I tell her that my weekend would be spent coordinating with operatives whose lives depended on the accuracy of the intelligence I provided? It's complicated, Mom. There are deadlines. Deadlines? She cut me off. For what, David? Filing paperwork? Processing forms? Do you honestly think whatever bureaucratic nonsense you're dealing with is more important than your family? The words hit like a slap. Bureaucratic nonsense. If she only knew that the quote-quote bureaucratic nonsense she was dismissing had prevented 3 terrorist attacks in the past 6 months. Operations that would have made international headlines if they had succeeded. This is exactly what I'm talking about, she continued, her voice rising. This is why your stepfather and I worry about you. You've become so wrapped up in this government job that you've lost perspective on what really matters. Family matters, David. Family should come first. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of their misunderstanding settle over me like a heavy blanket. I understand that family is important. Do you? She interrupted. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're using your job as an excuse to avoid real relationships, real responsibilities. Marcus has been asking about you, wondering why his own brother can't be bothered to show up for the most important event of his career. The guilt was expertly applied, a weapon she'd been wielding since I was a teenager. But this time, something else was building alongside the guilt, a cold, hard anger that I'd been suppressing for years. And another thing, she continued, apparently not finished with her lecture, Jennifer's been asking about you. She's worried that you're isolating yourself, that this job is turning you into some kind of hermit. She thinks maybe you need professional help. Professional help. My mother thought I needed therapy because I couldn't attend every family function, because my career demanded sacrifices they couldn't understand. The woman who had dismissed 15 years of military service as a, quote, phase, now thought my dedication to national security was a sign of mental illness. Jennifer thinks, she went on, and I agree with her, that maybe it's time for an intervention. Maybe we need to help you see that this path you're on isn't healthy. You're 34 years old, David. You have no girlfriend, no prospects for marriage, no real career advancement. At some point, you have to face reality. Reality. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. My reality involved briefing the president's security team, coordinating with foreign intelligence agencies, and carrying responsibilities that affected global stability. But in my mother's reality, I was a lonely government clerk who needed an intervention. "I've been talking to Bill about this," she continued, "and he thinks he might be able to help. He has connections with some successful businesses in Columbus. Real businesses, David, not government agencies. Places where you could build an actual future." The suggestion that my stepfather, with his chain of auto parts stores, had connections that could help me build a real future was almost surreal. But what came next crossed a line I didn't even know existed. "In fact," my mother said, her voice taking on the tone she used when she thought she was being generous, "Bill has already made some calls. There's a company called Midwest Industrial that supplies parts to manufacturing plants across the region. They're looking for someone to manage their government contracts. You know, dealing with all the bureaucratic red tape that companies have to navigate when they work with federal agencies. Bill thinks your government experience might actually be useful for something like that. Government contracts, red tape." She was suggesting that I leave my position as one of the nation's top intelligence officers to help a parts supplier navigate bureaucracy. The suggestion was so tone-deaf, so completely divorced from reality, that I felt something fundamental shift inside me. "It wouldn't pay as much as Marcus makes," she added quickly, "but it would be a start. A real job in the real world, working with real people instead of hiding away in some government office building. And David, the best part is that it's here in Ohio. You could move back home, maybe find a nice local girl, give us those grandchildren we've been waiting for." The complete dismissal of my career, my achievements, my entire adult life was devastating enough. But the casual suggestion that I should abandon everything I'd worked for to become a glorified paperwork processor for a parts supplier was the final straw. The assumption that my current work was so meaningless, that any entry-level position in the private sector would be an improvement, revealed just how little they understood about who I was or what I did. "Think about it, David," she concluded. "This could be your chance to finally get your life on track, to finally make something of yourself." Finally make something of myself. The phrase echoed in my mind as I sat in my car, rain streaming down the windows. In their eyes, 15 years of military service, a top-secret security clearance, and a position that gave me access to the highest levels of government decision-making amounted to nothing. I had made nothing of myself. "I need to go, Mom," I said quietly. "Just promise me you'll think about what I said. About the job, about coming home this weekend, about getting your priorities straight. We love you, David, but we're worried about you. This job of yours, whatever it is you actually do there, it's not healthy, it's not normal. Not normal." The woman who had raised me thought that serving my country, protecting American lives, and working at the highest levels of national security was abnormal. The disconnect was so complete, so fundamental, that I realized we were living in completely different universes. After I hung up, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the rain-blurred lights of my apartment complex. The conversation crystallized something that had been building for years, the understanding that my family would never see me as anything more than their greatest disappointment, regardless of what I achieved or how high I rose in my career. But more than that, the conversation had revealed something darker. They didn't just misunderstand my work, they actively dismissed it as meaningless. They didn't just fail to appreciate my achievements. They saw them as failures, and they weren't content to simply be disappointed in me. They wanted to rescue me from a life they considered pathetic. The rain continued to fall as I finally walked up to my apartment, but something fundamental had changed during that phone call. The part of me that had always hoped for their approval, their understanding, their pride, that part had finally died. What remained was a cold, hard determination to show them exactly who David Mitchell really was. I didn't know it then, but the opportunity would come sooner than I could have imagined, in a way that would leave them speechless and force them to confront the magnitude of their misjudgment. The catalyst had been struck, and everything that followed would be inevitable. The phone call with my mother had been the declaration of war, one didn't know I'd been waiting for. By Friday morning, less than 24 hours later, the universe conspired to give me the ammunition I needed to win it decisively. I was in my Pentagon office at 0630, reviewing overnight intelligence reports from our Middle East operations, when my secure phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I recognized immediately: General Patricia Hayes, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. When the highest-ranking military officer in the United States calls you personally, you don't let it go to voicemail. Colonel Mitchell, her voice was crisp and authoritative, I need you in my office at 0800. We have a situation that requires your immediate attention. 30 minutes later, I was walking through the corridors of the Pentagon's most secure section, past offices where the nation's most critical defense decisions were made. General Hayes's office was a testament to a lifetime of military service. Walls lined with commendations, photographs with world leaders, and maps marking global military operations. She was standing behind her desk when I entered, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour, her uniform bearing more ribbons than most officers see in a lifetime. Beside her stood two other figures I recognized from intelligence briefings: Deputy Secretary of Defense James Crawford and NSA Director Sarah Chen. "Colonel, sit down," General Hayes said, gesturing to a chair across from her massive mahogany desk. "What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room until we say otherwise." For the next 45 minutes, they briefed me on Operation Ironclad, the most significant intelligence operation the United States had undertaken in a decade. A joint CIA-NSA effort had uncovered a conspiracy involving state-sponsored terrorism, arms trafficking, and cyber warfare that threatened American interests across 4 continents. The operation required someone with my specific expertise in multi-agency coordination, someone who could manage assets across different intelligence communities while maintaining absolute operational security. "The President has personally approved this operation," General Hayes continued, "and he's specifically requested that you serve as the operational commander. This isn't just about your technical expertise, Mitchell. It's about your judgment, your leadership, and your ability to coordinate complex operations under extreme pressure." The weight of what she was saying began to settle in. This wasn't just another assignment. This was a career-defining moment that would cement my reputation in the intelligence community for decades to come. "However," Deputy Secretary Crawford interjected, "this assignment comes with unique challenges. You'll need to coordinate with civilian law enforcement, foreign intelligence services, and corporate security teams. Some of these interactions will require you to reveal your true rank and position to civilian authorities who aren't accustomed to working with military intelligence." NSA Director Chen opened a thick manila folder and slid it across the desk. "The operation has been in planning for 8 months, but recent intelligence indicates we need to accelerate the timeline. We're looking at a go date of next Tuesday." Next Tuesday, 4 days from now. 4 days to prepare for an operation that would involve coordinating assets across multiple agencies, managing relationships with foreign governments, and overseeing tactical operations that could reshape global security. "Path." "Colonel," General Hayes said, her eyes meeting mine directly, "I'm going to be frank with you. This operation will likely require you to interact with civilian contractors, corporate executives, and government officials who aren't cleared for the details of what we're doing. You'll need to establish your authority quickly and completely. That means they're going to know exactly who you are and what rank you hold." The implication was clear. My days of hiding behind vague job descriptions and modest government salaries were about to end. Operation Ironclad would thrust me into the spotlight of the intelligence community, making it impossible to maintain the fiction that I was just another bureaucratic desk jockey. "There's one more thing," General Hayes added, and I detected the slightest hint of a smile at the corners of her mouth. "The President has indicated that successful completion of this operation will result in your promotion to Brigadier General, with consideration for Major General within 18 months. At 34, that would make you one of the youngest general officers in the modern military." The room fell silent as the magnitude of what she'd just said sank in. Major General. 2 stars. A rank that would place me among the most senior military leaders in the nation, with responsibilities and authority that most officers never achieved in entire careers. "I understand this is a lot to process," Deputy Secretary Crawford said. "Do you have any questions about the assignment or the timeline?" I had 1,000 questions, but only one that mattered. "When do I start?" General Hayes nodded approvingly. "Your security detail will brief you on operational parameters at 1,400 hours. Your command authority begins Monday morning. Colonel Mitchell, the President is counting on you." As I walked back to my office, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. In 4 days, I would be commanding the most significant intelligence operation in recent memory. Within weeks, I would likely be promoted to general officer rank. The timing was almost poetic. Just as my family was suggesting I needed an intervention to help me find a real job, I was being entrusted with an operation that would affect national security for years to come. But first, I had a more personal mission to complete. The rest of Friday was spent in preparation, but not just for Operation Ironclad. I spent 2 hours with my security detail, reviewing protocols for interactions with civilian authorities. I met with the NSA's liaison team, discussing how to establish operational authority with corporate executives and foreign intelligence services. Most importantly, I worked with the Pentagon's protocol office to understand exactly how my rank and position should be presented in civilian settings. That evening, I called my mother back. "David," she answered on the second ring, her voice immediately hopeful. "I was hoping you'd call. Have you thought about what we discussed? About coming home this weekend?" "Actually, Mom, I've decided to come home," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral, "but not for Marcus's work event." "Oh." The disappointment was immediate. "Well, that's something, I suppose. Maybe you can at least meet with Bill about that job opportunity while you're here." "We'll see," I said. "But Mom, I need to ask you something. How would you feel about inviting some people from my work to meet the family?" The silence stretched for several seconds. "People from your work?" "David, I don't understand. What people?" "Some colleagues who might be in the area. Senior people. I think it would be good for the family to meet them, to understand what I actually do for a living." "Well," she said slowly, "I suppose that would be all right. How senior are we talking about, like middle management?" I almost laughed at the question. "Something like that, Mom. Something like that." The weekend drive to Ohio had a different quality this time. Instead of the familiar dread that usually accompanied these trips home, I felt a calm, cold clarity. My Honda Civic was loaded with overnight bags, but also with something else. A garment bag containing my dress blue uniform with all appropriate insignia, including the silver eagles that most people would never have the honor to wear. Saturday evening, I sat in my childhood bedroom, looking around at the same faded walls and dusty trophies that had witnessed so many moments of disappointment. But this time, instead of feeling like a museum of failure, the room felt like a launching pad. Tomorrow would change everything. My phone buzzed with a text message from General Hayes' aide. "Operation Ironclad team assembled. Awaiting your command authority activation Monday 0600. Presidential briefing scheduled Tuesday 0800. Presidential briefing. In 48 hours, I would be sitting across from the President of the United States, providing him with updates on an operation I was commanding. But first, I had a family dinner to attend. Sunday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of a perfect November day in Ohio. I dressed carefully in my civilian clothes, khakis, a button-down shirt, and a navy blazer that gave no hint of what was to come. My family had organized what they called a welcome home dinner, though I suspected it was really an intervention disguised as a family meal. I arrived at my mother's house at precisely 1,300 hours, a habit of military punctuality that had become second nature. The familiar smell of pot roast and vegetables greeted me, along with the sounds of family conversation drifting from the dining room. Marcus's BMW was in the driveway next to Bill's pickup truck, and I could see Jennifer's car parked on the street. "David!" my mother called as I entered through the front door. "Perfect timing, we're just about to sit down." The dining room was set for 6 people, with my mother's best china and the good silverware she usually reserved for holidays. Marcus was already seated at what had always been considered the head of the table, with Jennifer beside him. Bill occupied his usual spot, and my mother bustled around making final preparations. "Look what the cat dragged in," Marcus said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The prodigal son returns." I took my assigned seat, the same chair I'd occupied for family dinners since I was 12, and accepted the glass of wine my mother offered. The conversation began with the usual updates. Marcus's work, Jennifer's job at the local hospital, Bill's business, my mother's volunteer activities at church. "So, David," Bill said after we'd been eating for about 15 minutes, "your mother tells me you've been thinking about that opportunity I mentioned, the position with Midwest Industrial." Actually, I said, cutting a piece of pot roast, I've been thinking about a lot of things lately. About career paths, about family expectations, about what success really means. That's wonderful, my mother said, her face lighting up with hope. I think you're finally ready to be realistic about your future. Realistic, I repeated thoughtfully. Yes, I think it's time to be completely realistic about everything. Marcus leaned back in his chair, taking on the tone of an older brother dispensing wisdom. David, I know this might be hard to hear, but Jennifer and I have been talking, and we think you've been hiding behind this government job because you're afraid of real competition. In the private sector, you sink or swim based on results. Maybe that's been intimidating for you. Intimidating, I said, nodding slowly. That's an interesting perspective, Marcus. Tell me, what kind of results have you been delivering at Northbrook Financial? His chest puffed up slightly. Well, since you asked, I've generated over $40 million in revenue for the company this year. $40 million, David. That's real money, real impact. $40 million, I repeated. That is impressive. And you're up for senior vice president? That's right, he said, glancing around the table to make sure everyone was witnessing his moment of triumph. The announcement should come next week. Congratulations, I said sincerely. That's a significant achievement. The praise seemed to catch him off guard, and he looked almost suspicious. Thanks. I mean, it's just what happens when you commit yourself to excellence, instead of settling for mediocrity. The dig was subtle but unmistakable, and I saw my mother nod approvingly at her golden child's wisdom. Speaking of commitment to excellence, I said, reaching for my phone, I should probably check my messages. I'm expecting some important communications this weekend. David, my mother said with exasperation, we're having a family dinner. Can't your paperwork wait? It's not paperwork, Mom. I looked at my phone screen, where several messages waited, including one from General Hayes's office marked, Urgent, Eyes Only. Actually, some of my colleagues might need to reach me today. Senior colleagues. Bill chuckled. Senior colleagues in the government? What, like GS-14s and GS-15s? David, in the real world, senior means people who control budgets in the hundreds of millions. Hundreds of millions, I said thoughtfully. That's certainly significant. I paused, looking around the table at their expectant faces, though I suppose it depends on your perspective. Before anyone could respond, my phone began ringing. The caller ID showed Pentagon Secure Line. I looked at the display for a moment, then back at my family. I need to take this, I said, standing up from the table. David, for heaven's sake, my mother protested. We're in the middle of dinner. This is Colonel Mitchell, I answered, walking into the living room but speaking loudly enough for my voice to carry back to the dining room. The conversation that followed was brief but unmistakable. The Pentagon's Communications Center was relaying an urgent message from NSA Director Chen regarding Operation Ironclad. Technical details, classified terminology, and references to presidential authorization filled my responses. When I returned to the dining room, the table had fallen completely silent. Who was that? Jennifer asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Work, I said simply, taking my seat again. Work? Marcus's voice cracked slightly. David, did that person just call you Colonel? I met his eyes across the table. Yes, they did. Colonel, my mother repeated, as if testing the word. But that's a military rank. Yes, it is. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I don't understand, Bill said slowly. You work for the government, in an office building, doing paperwork. I work for the United States military, I corrected. Specifically, I'm Director of Advanced Intelligence Operations at the Pentagon. My office is 3 levels below ground in a section that requires top-secret clearance to access. Marcus was staring at me as if I'd just announced I was an alien. Intelligence operations? What does that even mean? Before I could answer, my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed SECDEF Office, the Secretary of Defense. Excuse me, I said, answering immediately. Colonel Mitchell. This conversation was longer, involving confirmation of operational parameters for Tuesday's presidential briefing and coordination with foreign intelligence assets. I used terms like compartmented intelligence, multi-agency coordination, and threat assessment protocols. When I hung up, my family was staring at me with expressions ranging from confusion to shock. "David," my mother said carefully, "what exactly do you do at work?" "I coordinate intelligence operations that protect American national security interests," I said matter-of-factly. "I analyze threats from hostile nations, terrorist organizations, and cyber warfare attacks. I brief senior government officials, including the President's National Security Council, on emerging threats and recommended responses." "The President's National Security Council," Jennifer whispered. "Among others," I confirmed. "This week, I'll be commanding a classified operation involving assets from the CIA, NSA, and Foreign Intelligence Services. It's been designated as critical to national security by the President himself." Marcus had gone completely pale. "Commanding? As in, you're in charge?" "Operational commander, yes. Starting tomorrow morning, I'll have authority over a multi-billion-dollar operation involving personnel across 4 continents. My mother set down her fork with shaking hands. "Multi-billion-dollar? David, how is that possible? You drive a Honda Civic, you live in a modest apartment." "Because I serve my country, Mom, not my bank account. My security clearance alone is worth more than Marcus makes in 3 years, but that's not why I do this work." Bill was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Security clearance? What kind of security clearance?" "Top secret, sensitive compartmented information, with access to special access programs. There are maybe a few thousand people in the entire country with my level of clearance." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different, heavy, pregnant with the weight of 15 years of misunderstanding collapsing in real time. "I need to ask you something," I continued, looking directly at my mother. "When you suggested that I needed professional help, that I needed an intervention, what exactly did you think was wrong with me?" She opened and closed her mouth several times before managing to speak. We thought we were worried that you were wasting your life in some dead-end government job." "Dead end," I repeated. "Mom, I'm 34 years old, and I'm about to be promoted to brigadier general. Within 18 months, I'll likely make major general. Do you understand what that means?" "General?" Marcus's voice was barely audible. "2-star general," I confirmed, "which would make me one of the youngest general officers in the modern military, with authority over operations affecting global security." My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it and saw it was from General Hayes' aide. "Confirmation, presidential briefing moved to 0730 Tuesday. POTUS specifically requested your operational assessment." I showed the message to my family. "POTUS means President of the United States," I explained. "He's moved our briefing earlier because he wants my assessment of the operation I'm commanding." The transformation in the room was almost physical. Where there had been condescension and pity, there was now something approaching awe. But more than that, there was embarrassment, the dawning realization of how completely they had misunderstood their own family member. "David," my mother said, her voice trembling, "we had no idea. We thought, all these years, we thought you were just—" "Just what, Mom? Just a failure? Just someone who needed to be rescued from his own poor choices?" Tears were forming in her eyes. "We're so sorry. We didn't know. How could we have known?" "You couldn't have known the details," I said, my voice gentler now. "My work is classified. But you could have trusted that I knew what I was doing. You could have respected my choices instead of assuming I was making mistakes." Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. "David, all those things I said about real jobs, about real money. You were measuring success by the only standards you understood," I said. "But Marcus, the work I do affects the safety of millions of people. The decisions I make influence foreign policy and national security. When I prevent a terrorist attack, no one writes articles about it. When I help avoid an international crisis, there are no public awards. But the President of the United States knows my name, and world leaders have been briefed on my capabilities." The dinner table, which had been set for a family intervention, had become the site of a complete reversal of everything they thought they knew about me. The weeks that followed that Sunday dinner were unlike anything my family had ever experienced. The revelation of my true position had shattered their understanding not just of me, but of what success and service really meant. Operation Ironclad launched on Tuesday as scheduled, and for the next 10 days I lived in a world of encrypted communications, international coordination, and presidential briefings. The operation was more successful than anyone had dared hope. We dismantled a terrorist financing network, prevented 3 planned attacks, and gathered intelligence that would protect American interests for years to come. But the most remarkable change wasn't in my work life. It was in my relationship with my family. The first sign came on Wednesday, when my mother called me at my Pentagon office. My assistant, who was accustomed to screening calls from family members who didn't understand the nature of my work, was surprised when my mother identified herself and asked to speak with Colonel Mitchell. "David," she said when I picked up the phone, "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. I know you're in the middle of something important." The consideration in her voice was something I hadn't heard in 15 years. "It's fine, Mom. What's going on?" "I wanted to apologize," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "Not just for Sunday, but for all of it. For all the years we didn't understand, didn't support you, didn't see what you were accomplishing." "Mom!" "No, let me finish," she interrupted. "Your stepfather and I have been talking, and we realize how wrong we were. We were so focused on our own definition of success that we couldn't see yours. We're proud of you, David. We're so incredibly proud of you." The words I'd been waiting to hear for 15 years had finally come, but they felt different than I'd imagined. There was relief, yes, but also a sadness for all the years we'd lost to misunderstanding. The change in Marcus was even more dramatic. 3 days after our dinner, he showed up at my apartment in Virginia, having driven 6 hours from Ohio. "I needed to see you," he said when I opened the door. "I needed to apologize in person." We sat in my living room, surrounded by the subtle indicators of my real life, the maps marking global operations, the commendations from foreign governments, the photograph of me with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "David, I feel like I've been living in a completely different reality," he said. "All those things I said about real jobs, about real success. I was talking to someone who literally helps run the country, and I was offering you a position in the mailroom." "You didn't know," I said. "And Marcus, what you do matters too. The economy, financial systems, the business world. It's all important." "But it's not national security," he said quietly. "It's not protecting people's lives. I make money, David. You save lives." The conversation lasted for hours, and by the end of it, something fundamental had shifted between us. For the first time in our lives, we weren't competing. We were just 2 brothers, each successful in our own way, finally understanding each other. The formal recognition came 3 weeks later. General Hayes called me into her office on a Friday afternoon, but this time she wasn't alone. The Secretary of Defense was there, along with several other senior officials I recognized from television news programs. "Colonel Mitchell," General Hayes began, "the President has asked me to personally inform you that Operation Ironclad has been deemed one of the most successful intelligence operations in recent memory. The terrorist network you helped dismantle was planning attacks that could have killed thousands of Americans and our allies." She paused, reaching for a folder on her desk. "Therefore, by order of the President, you are hereby promoted to the rank of Brigadier General, effective immediately." The ceremony was small but profound. As the single star was pinned to my uniform, I thought about all the family gatherings where my achievements had gone unrecognized, all the times I'd been encouraged to find a real job, all the years I'd carried the weight of their disappointment. But what surprised me was that I felt no vindication, no sense of "I told you so." Instead, I felt a deep satisfaction that came not from proving my family wrong, but from knowing that my work mattered, that my service had value beyond their ability to measure it. The real celebration came the following weekend, when I drove home to Ohio wearing my general's uniform for the first time. My mother met me at the door, and for the first time in 15 years, the pride in her eyes was unmistakable. The family dinner that night was different in every way. Instead of dismissing my work, they asked careful, respectful questions about what I could share. Instead of suggesting career changes, they expressed admiration for my dedication. Instead of measuring my success by their standards, they began to understand that service itself was a form of success. "I have something for you," my mother said after dinner, leading me upstairs to my old room. There, hanging on the wall in a place of honor, was a framed photograph of me in my dress uniform, taken the day I'd received my Bronze Star. Below it was a small plaque that read, "Brigadier General David Mitchell, in service to his country and his family." "I found it in your stepfather's desk," she said softly. It should have been on this wall 15 years ago. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Bill pulled me aside before I left for Washington. "David," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "I owe you an apology. I spent years trying to convince you to be someone else, when you were already someone extraordinary. I was just too stubborn to see it." He paused, looking out at the Ohio farmland that had shaped his understanding of success and hard work. "I want you to know that from now on, when people ask me about my family, the first thing I'm going to tell them is that my stepson is a general in the United States Army. And that I'm proud as hell of him." 6 months later, I was promoted to Major General, making me one of the youngest two-star generals in modern military history. The ceremony was held at the Pentagon, with full military honors and representatives from allied nations in attendance. But what made it special wasn't the rank or the recognition. It was seeing my family in the front row, finally understanding what I'd always known, that serving something greater than yourself is the highest form of success. The road to that understanding had been long and painful, marked by years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities for connection. But it had led to something better than validation. It had led to genuine respect, authentic pride, and a family relationship built on truth rather than expectations. As I stood at attention during the promotion ceremony, looking out at the assembled military leadership and foreign dignitaries, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The young lieutenant who had been dismissed as playing dress-up, the captain whose Bronze Star had gone unnoticed, the colonel whose work was considered bureaucratic nonsense. That journey had forged me into someone who could command respect on the world stage. But the real victory wasn't the rank or the recognition. It was the knowledge that my family finally saw me not as their disappointment but as their hero. And more importantly, I had learned that their approval, while meaningful, was never what had driven me. I had found my purpose in service, my identity in duty, and my satisfaction in protecting the country I loved. The little boy who had once desperately wanted his family to understand him had grown into a man who understood himself. And that, more than any promotion or recognition, was the true measure of success. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.